What's up guys, TechLab here, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at this little legend from AMD. This is the AMD Radeon RX 480. It is an infamous card that was created by AMD in 2016, and of course we want to find out how well it games in 2023. So of course this is the infamous AMD Radeon RX 480, and I have wanted one of these for ages. It's just unfortunate that when I wanted one it was the GPU apocalypse and these things went for an absolute fortune. These cards were running at around £300, when before that, before the actual mining boom and things like that, they were going for around £80. I think that was pretty fair back in the day. But of course, not only were they expensive, they were really hard to find because they make great mining cards. The one we have here today is of course a reference model, the one that I actually preferred and the one I wanted. I didn't want an AIB version of these. I wanted a reference model, even though it's got a blower cooler and lots of people say they're pretty loud. This one actually isn't too bad, particularly when we were testing it. I couldn't really hear it over the rest of the system, so I was pretty impressed with that. It came in mint condition and I paid an absolute bargain for this of just £35. Now £35 for one of these cards even today is an amazing price because they actually are great performers. But let's have a look at what's under the covers on this one and see why they were actually so popular back in the day. Now the RX 480 obviously replaced the R9 series of graphics cards back when AMD had a bit of a weird way of naming things. Of course they sorted themselves out and started to call these cards the RX cards. The RX 480 was pretty much the flagship of the time and it was released in 2016. It used a Polaris 10 XT GPU, an interface with a PCI Gen 3 x 16. It has a base clock speed of 1120 MHz and a boost clock speed of 1266 MHz, and it also came with 2304 shaders. But one thing that's actually made this card live a little bit longer is of course the VRAM. Inside the model that we've got today is 8GB of GDDR5, and it's also not a power hungry pig, just consuming 150 watts. As I said before, it was released in 2016 and it had a release price in the UK of around £220. Now £220 would be an astonishing price nowadays. For that you're probably looking at something like the RX 6600. Again, another card that comes with 8GB of RAM, hasn't really moved that far, but it is a much faster card and would make more sense to somebody buying today, except these are going much cheaper. Like I said before, I paid £35 for this card and I am super impressed with that kind of money, particularly on how well this card performs. Now when it comes to performance, of course we have done some benchmarking, but we've done it a little bit different today. Instead of getting this card to target our normal 1080p or 1440p high settings and just seeing what it could actually do, it's a little bit of an old card now, so of course it would struggle, particularly with some of the more modern titles. So instead we've used the same test suite of games, but this time we've configured the settings to try and find that best sweet spot for it, and I was actually greatly surprised by what we got. Our first game tested today is Back 4 Blood, a growing classic and a personal favourite of mine. With a resolution of 1080p and the graphics preset of high, we can see that the RX 480 is still more than capable when it comes to some much newer titles, getting an average of 84 frames per second with a 1% low of 34. The 1% lows here were not great considering the average FPS, but there was no visible stuttering during gameplay and the experience was actually quite good. Cyberpunk 2077 up next, and this title is one that has gotten much better over time due to its continuous performance optimizations, and it really has helped older cards like the RX 480 a lot. I'm not a big fan of the game myself, but I like to include it within the benchmarks to really push the card to its limits, and that was definitely shown here. The RX 480 was pushed to its limits, but using a resolution of 1080p with a medium preset and a little help from FSR with a balanced setting, we managed to get an average of 60 FPS with a 1% low of 47. Visual quality did take a small hit with this configuration, but it didn't take away from the game that much, and I can confidently say that it was more than playable. Doom Eternal is a great example of a game that will run really nice on a graphics card of this age, and can be pushed much higher in terms of settings than many others due to its amazing optimizations. At an increased resolution of 1440p with a high preset, you can easily achieve an above 70 average FPS with a 1% low that closely follows. This makes the game a bit of a dream to play, to be honest, because the visual quality is amazing while also being an extremely smooth experience. Now God of War in the past has been a bit of a demanding game for many of the GPUs that I've tested, but with its regular updates and optimizations, it's actually turned out to be quite a good one for those on older hardware. With a resolution of 1080p and an original graphics preset, we managed to get an average of 62 frames per second with a 1% low of 50. Unlike some of the newer AMD cards, there was no visible stutters throughout the gameplay, which made it a pleasurable experience. If you haven't played played God of War yet, you should definitely try it out because it's actually quite good. Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the oldest games in our test suite, but it's also quite a demanding game, but nothing that the RX 480 couldn't handle. With a resolution of 1080p and a graphics preset of balanced, we managed to get an average of 72 frames per second with a 1% low of 54. Now, because the game doesn't really require much more than 60 frames per second to play really, you could raise those graphics settings just a little bit, but to be honest, I didn't really see much of a difference, so you won't be missing out on much. The RX 480 had no issues running Spider-Man Remastered, but then this game did start out very well optimized. Being a relatively new title, I actually expected it to do worse than it did, and with a high preset it actually did, but lowering that preset to just a medium setting at a resolution of 1080p, the game became very smooth, and you didn't even lose that much in terms of visual quality. The RX 480 here managed to get an average of 75 frames per second with a 1% low of 50. Even titles like The Last of Us Part 1 will run on a GPU like the RX 480, although it does require a bit of configuration as well as a little help from software. Even trying this game in a 1080p with a high preset is not recommended, as it played absolutely awful, but lowering the preset down to a medium and enabling AMD's FSR with the performance setting meant you could actually play it, and it wasn't even that bad. With these settings it played pretty smoothly, getting an average of 50 frames per second and a 1% low of 33, but it didn't look great, so here you will have to decide what is more important to you. So as we can see from the results of the benchmark, the RX 480 8GB isn't dead yet. You can actually play pretty modern games. You will need to tweak some of those settings, you will lose a little bit of that visual fidelity, but the games are more than playable and you can actually pretty much play anything. We were playing The Last of Us Part 1. Again, graphics were a little bit low, but you could get away with it. It was super smooth gameplay and you can complete it end to end. And if it can play The Last of Us Part 1, it's a bit of a win in the bag for us. I can't believe that I actually got this card for such a low price. It does make it one of the best value cards I've ever had on the channel. Anything that actually cost roughly around the same price as this has been really old, and you wouldn't really play any kind of modern games for it. We tend to use them for things like retro gaming systems, but this card still packs a punch today. The RX 480 has impressed me and I'm going to be keeping it around for a while. Maybe we'll include it in some builds going forward, or maybe we'll just mount it to the wall behind us so that you guys can see it going forward. But either way, you won't want to miss that, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments below, do you still run an RX 480? Do you have the 4GB or the 8GB version? Is it still enough for you? And if you do, are you actually looking to upgrade yet, or are you still gonna play through until it's dead? I'm gonna go away and have a bit of a play with this card a little bit more, and I'm sure as always we will catch you in the next one.